Hey everyone, welcome back to Creative Raw. My name is Chris O'Donnell, and thanks for joining me for another Lightroom video here. Now in this lesson, we're going to take a look at the histogram, which may look familiar to you. It's this little graph here in the top right-hand corner of either the library or the develop module. Now before we get into any kind of processing in the develop module here, even before we make basic adjustments such as lens corrections or setting a color profile, I want to make sure that you understand how the histogram works for evaluating your exposure. Now many of the tools we'll be discussing rely on reading the histogram correctly, and I see many photographers not fully understand how to properly read it, especially in Lightroom because there are some additional features here that you may not know about. Or perhaps some have these preconceived notions about how to interpret the peaks and valleys here of this graph. It's not as straightforward as you may think, so in order to get the most out of this program and fully understand everything that I go over in the future lessons, you really need to have a solid understanding of how the histogram works. So here's an overview of this lesson. First, we're going to go over the basics of the histogram, what it is, and how to interpret the distribution of tones. Then we'll talk about how the histogram protects your image both in the field and here in processing. There's also a difference in accuracy between your in-camera histogram and the histogram you see in Lightroom and Photoshop, so we'll go over that and how that works. Then we'll talk about the difference between the overall tonal histogram and the specific color channel histograms. And finally, we'll go over some general tips and hidden features of how the histogram works in Lightroom. Now, if you would like to follow along with this tutorial step by step, you can download the actual practice files I'm using here, which I recommend doing because this is an in-depth tutorial, and it'll probably take you several watches in order to absorb everything taught here. And that's a lot easier to accomplish when you get hands-on right away and actually go through the steps yourself on your computer. So I'll put a link below this video, but you can go to creativeraw.com/course, and here you can sign up for my free course on the foundations of Lightroom and Photoshop. All you need to do is put in your email address and hit start now, and you'll be emailed a username and password for a free account here on Creative Raw, which is this page right here. So inside of this free account, you'll find a download link for the practice files I'm using in this video, and also a link to download the actual video. Now this free account here, you can think of it like a vault. And this is where I store all of my free courses. I have a video course here on the basics of processing in the digital darkroom, and then I have some lessons on Lightroom, Photoshop, and some of my favorite tools that are found in both Lightroom and Photoshop. And you can see right here I have a link to the histogram lesson, which I've broken up into 5 separate videos that you can download individually. Now this free account also includes downloadable PDF guides that you can take with you in the field, and I also have full ebooks that you can download on landscape photography and creative processing. And I also have, let me scroll back up here, I also have links to several in-depth written tutorials that you'll find here in the sidebar. These discuss some of my favorite techniques and concepts on Lightroom, Photoshop, and landscape photography. So you will find a lot of resources here inside of this account that I think you will find very helpful. And again, every video lesson is completely downloadable, as well as the practice files, so you can save these offline to access on your own time. So again, all you need to do to gain access to this free account is to go to creativeraw.com/course and sign up right here. So let's start with the basics. I'm going to use a black and white image here since it's easy to understand how the histogram works without color. And then we'll look at a color image afterwards. So let me hide this film strip here, get a bigger view. Now the simplest definition of the histogram is that it's a sophisticated tool for evaluating your exposure. It's a visual representation of the distribution of tones in your image, from pure black here on the left to pure white on the right. In other words, it's a way to map out how many shadows and highlights you have, because simply eyeballing it, it's just not good enough. Your eye cannot always detect whether or not you have under or overexposed parts to your image, so we rely on the histogram here to tell us that by mapping out where our pixels fall on the tonal scale. Now, photographers use a histogram for many situations, both creative and technical. It's not just about determining whether or not parts of your image are over or underexposed. But the primary use of a histogram is to tell us whether or not we have lost detail in an image, if we've damaged the image in any way, which can be one of two things. The first reason is that you haven't captured the full amount of detail on your camera sensor due to a mismatch from the amount of light that was let into the camera and the amount of light needed to capture all of the detail. So in other words, it means your image is either over or underexposed from the field. And the second reason is that your processing techniques may have damaged the image. So while the original RAW file may be perfectly fine in exposure, perhaps you increased the contrast or did some other tonal adjustments here in processing that damaged the photo. So the histogram here is used to first evaluate your raw image straight from the camera to see if any mistakes were made in the field, and then you'll use the histogram to monitor your tones as you process your image in order to alert you to any problems if you're pushing your pixels too far, and then you can intervene and recover that damaged detail. So let's take a look at another image. This is a single frame from a bracket. And you can tell just by looking at it, it's very underexposed. See how there's no real detail here? It's just big chunky parts of shadow, and you can't really tell the texture of the rocks or the trees. Not a lot of detail in the sky, really flat and uninteresting. So this is what the histogram on your camera will help you avoid, and you can adjust your exposure as necessary in the field. So your in-camera histogram is immensely helpful. So let's jump back to this image here, and let's take a look at the histogram here so you can further understand how this works. So this graph represents your tonal range, meaning the range of brightness possible from pure black to pure white. So this path from left to right, from black to white, represents all of the possible brightness levels in your image. Now the histogram itself has an X and Y axis, so it is meant to be read both horizontally and vertically. What I mean by that is the vertical part, how high these peaks go. This represents how much of the image contains that particular tone, or rather how many pixels have that tone. And the horizontal line here from left to right, this represents how bright or dark those tones are. So pure black all the way to the left, pure white all the way to the right. In the area in between those 2 points will be some shade of gray. So these tones right here, pure black, and these tones right here are a few points brighter than pure black, and you keep going up in brightness till you get to pure white. So the horizontal axis represents the tone, the brightness, and the vertical axis represents the amount or frequency of that particular tone. So looking at this image here, the highest peak is right around the halfway point between pure black and middle gray here. So this is the highest concentration of tones for this particular image. So let's take a look at the tone curve here because this will help us understand the histogram as well. So you can see in the background this has a histogram, and it works the same way. Left to right is black to white, and up and down represents the frequency of that particular tone. So for example, if I take my target adjustment tool and I hover over this tone right here, you can see that little black dot that appeared on the graph, that is pretty close to pure white. And if I hover around this tone right here, which is a deep shadow, that is right at pure black, 0.0%. So this area right here is as dark as you can get for this image. Now there are a limitless number of tones out there, but programs like Lightroom and Photoshop and most photo editing programs compartmentalize these tones ranging from 0, pure black, to 255, which represents pure white. And this is needed in order to map out the histogram here. So all the deepest shadows will be represented by 0, and then 1 will be all of the shadows that are slightly lighter than pure black, and then you keep going all the way up to 255. And one thing I want to point out is that the histogram will directly correspond to the Develop module basic sliders. I open up the basic panel here. You notice that I hover over certain parts of the histogram, they get highlighted down in the basic panel. So I'm hovering over my midtones, that is represented by the exposure slider. If I go over to the left, I have my shadows, that is represented by the shadow slider. And then my blacks, highlights, and whites. You actually click and drag these around directly on the histogram in order to redistribute those tones. Works the same thing as dragging these sliders around. Now, in a later lesson, we'll go over these specific tonal sliders, but for now, I just wanted to point that out here. Okay, so back to the histogram. So the histogram itself, the graph, represents what is possible, what is available to you. This entire area right here. And the content of the graph, this little gray area right here, the peaks and valleys of it, represents what is actually in the image. Okay, so this is actually a JPEG. I'm going to go over to an actual RAW file because that is what you'll most likely be working with. Let me grab this one here. Now you'll notice underneath the histogram when you have a RAW file selected, we have little shortcuts to some EXIF information about the photo. So we have the ISO, the focal length, the f-stop, and the shutter speed. So that's a nice little shortcut there to double check your EXIF info. It's really handy when you're flipping through images here in the develop module and you just want to compare shutter speeds or apertures. And Histogram will also tell you some additional information about your preview file. So right now this is listed as the original photo, means that I'm connected to my original source file for this image on my external drive. It's plugged in. So it means you can see this image at full resolution if you zoom in. In other words, you're not limited by the size of your preview or your smart preview. It'll also tell you whether or not you have a smart preview built for this image. If I hover over this, it's given me the option to build a smart preview, which means that it hasn't been built yet. So it's a handy little shortcut if you're flipping through your raw files and you want to build some smart previews on the fly. It also makes you aware as to what is possible when you're editing in the develop module, whether you can edit one by being connected to the original, and you're able to generate that temporary raw file for processing, or if you're working with a smaller, more limited file, such as a smart preview. So this image here, if we are reading the histogram for it, this graph is purely gray because we were working with a black and white image. If we were working with a color image, actually let me switch this to color treatment, you can see that we still have this gray graph. This is called the RGB histogram. But now we have the additional color histograms that you can kind of make out here in the background. You can see there's a little peak of blue here, some yellow right here, a little bit of red up in the highlights. This represents how your individual color channels deviate from the collective RGB histogram represented by gray. We'll talk more about this later on in the lesson, but I just want to show you the difference here. Let's go back to the black and white treatment. Now, if we're reading this histogram, you can see that there's a pretty high peak here right around my highlights, push all the way up to the very brightest whites. This is telling me that there's a high concentration here of very bright pixels. And when looking at the image, you can tell it right away. The entire sky and a little bit of the foreground here is pretty bright, which is a substantial portion of the photo. If I grab my exposure here and I keep pushing it up to brighten the image, you'll notice how the tones in the histogram are starting to be pushed all the way to the right, meaning that those tones are getting brighter and brighter. And same thing will happen if I drop the exposure. If I make this image darker, the tones are now being pushed towards the left. So now you can see that the peak here we had originally representing my very bright highlights has now been pushed down a little bit. And this is represented visually on the image. We're starting to make out some detail in the sky and those clouds that wasn't there originally. Now we have a much higher concentration of shadows because we've dropped the exposure by a stop and a half. So this is very helpful for instantly recognizing whether your image is either over or underexposed, because when your image is underexposed, you can see right away the very high concentration of shadows here in relation to the rest of the histogram. That can indicate that the photo wasn't exposed properly. Now, of course, there are some specific examples where this would still be okay. For example, if you're photographing a very high-key or low-key image. If I was purposely going for a very dark and moody photo, then this concentration of shadows wouldn't be a problem. But it does give you an instant way to recognize whether or not the exposure is where you want it to be. Same thing if I overexpose this image. Let's push it all the way up by a couple stops here. This would be instantly recognizable as being overexposed. There's a very high and narrow peak, very steep peak of very bright highlights here. This peak here indicates that the image has overexposed areas. And when you turn the highlight clipping indicator on, these blotchy red areas tell you right away, okay, you have overexposed pixels and these areas are damaged. There's no detail here. Same thing if we drop the exposure down a lot. A very high peak here in the shadows indicates that you have crushed shadows. So if you couldn't tell just by looking at your photo, the histogram helps a lot in determining whether or not you have areas of damage. So let's reset the exposure here. Okay, now let's switch over to color and talk about how the color histogram works with your exposure. Now, when we bring color into the mix, this adds another dimension to the histogram. Okay, so let's switch to a color image here, because when you bring color into the mix, this adds another dimension to the histogram. As I mentioned earlier, we have these additional color histograms representing how these specific color channels deviate from the RGB histogram here. So looking at the color histogram, we have two things we can recognize instantly for this photo. So that there's a high peak of blue in the shadows, and that we have higher peaks of red and yellow in the highlights. This tells me that the image has a lot of blue right around these particular tones, the shadows and the darker tones of the exposure. So here's pure black, here's middle gray, so this is right in between those 2 points. So what these color channel histograms are doing is that it's measuring the brightness distribution for each color individually. So we can instantly tell that there are a lot of darker blues and brighter reds and yellows. Now we'll get into how to read a color histogram in a moment, but for now all you need to know is that colors have their own lightness level, which deviates from the collective RGB histogram here. In other words, yellows and reds are typically brighter than blues and purples. And that's very important to know because you can easily see if one color is over or underexposed. Because relying strictly on the RGB histogram here, you may not be able to tell that. The exposure may seem fine, but a specific color channel may be getting clipped and you don't know it. So that's the important takeaway here. So speaking of clipping, just want to go over that a little bit more just to make sure you understand what it means to clip your detail. So let me bring down the exposure a lot here, really underexpose this image. Actually, this is a JPEG, it's not going to work. Let me get an actual RAW file like this one and underexpose. So as I mentioned, the left side of the histogram represents pure black, the very left side, the number 0 of the tonal scale. So any peak in your histogram at this point is underexposed. It's pure black, which means no detail is currently represented for these areas. If I open up the tone curve here and take my target adjustment tool and hover over certain areas, you can see that, especially over here, you can see that the point on the graph is at pure 0, which means that these pixels are damaged. This is called blocking up your shadows. Now on the other hand, if we bring up the exposure all the way, really overexpose this image, let's go back to that tone curve, hover over some blown out detail, you can see that the point on the graph is now at 100%, or pretty close to it, 99.9. In other words, it's at tone number 255, the brightest tone in the graph. So when you get a bunch of tones pushed up along the right-hand side of the histogram, that means that you've overexposed parts of your image. And it means the same thing. It means no detail is represented in these areas. This is called blowing out your highlights and means you've lost detail. So typically, crushed shadows and blown highlights, it's not something you want to see. In very specific situations, you can get away with a small amount of either block shadows or blown highlights. That could be a creative choice, but typically you don't want to see this. This is called clipping your detail or exposure, since you are clipping out or cutting off the detail in your image. Now you can always check your image for blown or block detail by just looking at the histogram in the field, and your camera may be equipped with your clipping warnings, which are here in Lightroom and Photoshop. We turn these triangles on. It'll highlight specific areas in your image with either red or blue, telling you that these areas have been clipped. So even though the overall image is really overexposed, only the areas in red have been damaged. Those areas are clipped. Same thing if we drop the exposure. Although the entire image is very underexposed, you can barely make out any detail, there is still a little bit of detail in these darker shadows until we get to the areas highlighted in blue. Those pixels have been damaged and clipped. There's absolutely no detail in those areas. You can also press J to toggle these clipping indicators on or off. Okay, so let me double click to reset my exposure. Now, when you're adjusting the exposure of a RAW file like this, I typically do not push it more than 2 full stops in either direction. That is roughly the limit of exposure recovery from a RAW file. Unless you're working with an HDR RAW file that you've already blended together, you can push it a little bit more. But if you need to adjust your exposure by any more than a couple stops, then it's best to capture it in the field at the correct exposure. Also, adjusting the exposure of a RAW file more than a stop in either direction, it doesn't always give you the best results. For example, increasing the exposure of clipped shadows will often produce a lot of noise, even if it's only by a stop or two. And the same thing for reducing the exposure of clipped highlights. That'll often give you muddy colors and tones. In other words, it's not the highest quality detail. It's much better to actually have captured this in the field at the correct exposure. We'll go over this in more detail in a different lesson on exposure blending in HDR. But I just wanted to touch on that here while we're talking about clip detail. Thankfully though, most modern DSLRs will display a histogram and your clipping warnings with your image on the camera, so you can make exposure changes in the field. It's really difficult to evaluate your exposure by just looking at your screen, whether you're on your phone or your camera, especially when you're photographing under the sun with all these glares and shadows. It's really hard to tell. So the histogram is a really great field tool that can save an otherwise unrecoverable image. Now, one thing to keep in mind though is that your camera will display the histogram of a JPEG, which is in the sRGB color space. You're not seeing the histogram of the raw file itself, since the camera can't interpret a raw file. So the camera histogram is based off a JPEG, much like how the image preview you see on your screen is actually JPEG and not the actual raw file. The histogram isn't based off the raw file either, which is why your raw file will often look flatter and less vibrant once you get into Lightroom on your computer screen than what it looked like on your camera or your phone. Now, since a RAW file has more information than a JPEG, this means that the histogram on your camera will clip the highlights and the shadows before they're actually being clipped. Now, keep this in mind when you're working with the outer edges of your histogram, and know that you have a little bit of leeway once you get that image into Lightroom or Photoshop. In other words, when you're in the field, it's okay to have an image that has a little bit of clip detail on your camera histogram. And that's not going to be an issue for you once you bring that photo into Lightroom. Now, this is why many photographers recommend shooting to the right or until right before you start to blow out your detail. This really helps you process your shadows as well, since opening up your shadows and processing will often produce excess noise and muddy detail. So very generally speaking, it's better to expose your image in the field so that most of your tones are on the right side of middle gray. So for this image here, this would not be a good example because most of the tones are to the left of middle gray. This, maybe a little bit more. This right here would be a more ideal exposure. We do have a very small amount of detail that's starting to get clipped here. We can tell that's the case with this little area of clipped highlights, but it's so small and unnoticeable. We can correct that later here in processing. The real goal here is to lift the shadows just enough so we can still make out all of the great detail without having to artificially increase the exposure. So for this image here, this is what I would like to see in the field, because this will give me a cleaner image than a histogram that looks more like this. So try to shoot more towards the right as opposed to trying to keep your histogram centered around middle gray, because that'll give you a little more leeway in your processing. Okay, so let's move on to color and the histogram. So the RGB histogram, this gray histogram here, this only shows you the number of pixels with RGB in it. In other words, it's being represented by all colors. Now, I have another lesson on color contrast and luminosity that goes into this in much further detail. But very basically, colors have their own unique lightness levels. For example, yellows are much lighter than blues, which is why you'll often see a blue histogram with peaks around the shadows and red and yellow histograms with peaks around the brighter tones. So when you're looking at the RGB histogram here, this is only showing you the tonal values or the brightness of pixels that have RGB in them. But if you have an image with a lot of blues or yellows, there could be pixels that are clipped in just those colors, not all of them. So that is why you have histograms for the individual color channels, just in case you're underexposing just your blues, but not your other colors. So looking at this histogram right here, we can see the RGB histogram isn't underexposed at all. However, we do have a very high peak of blues pushed up right against pure black. So the point here is you can't always rely on this gray histogram. You really need to consider your other color channels as well. So when you're out in the field, this is very important to look at. Make sure to look at your RGB histograms individually, the color histograms, because you could potentially be blowing out just one of those colors and clipping your detail, which is not always reflected in the average tonal histogram. This is very common when you're shooting sunsets or sunrises. Those usually have a very high concentration of red and yellow. So you could be completely blowing out your red channel, but when you're looking at the regular histogram here, it could look perfectly fine. And this is also why I often bracket my scene, even though it may not look like I need to based on the histogram. I'll just do it anyways because I'd rather have too much information and not need it than vice versa. The goal for me is to work with as much information as possible and then get rid of the info I don't need, because that will give me more options in processing. Now, another reason why this histogram is not 100% accurate is because it's based on the brightness values. It does not reflect the actual lightness of your image. In other words, the hue of your image, the change in color, that can affect the lightness of your pixels. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I do have another video which explains this concept in much greater detail. That video on color, contrast, and luminosity. But very basically, it's difficult to accurately judge the brightness of a color when working on the computer, which is read by the RGB histogram you see here. If you take the color yellow and blue and you set them at the same luminosity and saturation levels, yellow is going to be much lighter than blue. Colors have their own lightness levels, and this histogram here does not reflect the actual lightness, which is different than the brightness. A lot of people think that lightness and brightness means the same thing when processing an image on the computer, but actually they're a little bit different. Now over in Photoshop you can see a true lightness histogram, but not here in Lightroom, not yet anyways. All you can really do here is, if we right click on this and go down to Show Lab Color Values, if you hover over your image here, you can see that right under the histogram there is an L, and next to it says 18.2. This is telling me that the lightness of this area is at 18.2. Where if I go over here to a very bright area, the lightness is 97.7 on a scale of 100. So that lightness number is a little bit different than the histogram. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Now as a final note here before we wrap up this video is that there is no ideal histogram shape here. Based on the information we've gone over, you would think that the ideal histogram would look like a bell curve, where most of the information is right around the middle gray, with very little information bunched up on either the left hand or the right hand side of the histogram. But that is not the case at all. For example, if I look at my final photos here, I have a particular image in mind that I want to look at. Okay, this photo right here. If we're looking at the actual histogram, you would probably think this image is really underexposed and not ideal at all. However, looking at the photo, I really like the overall atmosphere and feel of this image. So although the histogram looks pretty awful, the creative goal I was going for this photo has been accomplished. This is how I want my photo to be. And if we go to a very bright image, okay, this one will do. Looking at the histogram here, you would say, okay, this isn't ideal either. I'm missing all of my deeper shadows and most of my midtones here. The histogram really doesn't start to pick up until right around here. So this is a very high-key image, but when looking at the actual photo, I wouldn't consider this a failure. I really like the image how it is. So there's definitely a big difference here between reading just the histogram and then looking at the photo. So the point here is the histogram is nothing more than a visual guide to help create the image you want and prevent any damage. It's not a goal you're trying to achieve. For example, if I drop the exposure of this image so that most of the tones were right around middle gray, so let's say right around here, and let me lighten up on the saturation a bit because now we have a really odd yellow tinge here. Actually, let me do a white balance adjustment instead. Let's cool that down, and now I'll desaturate. Okay, so now we have this image here. Does it still work? Yes, it's okay, but I much prefer the original here. Actually, let's do a before and after comparison. I think the high-key version of this image is much more effective. This image over here seems to be a little underexposed, although looking at the histogram, you wouldn't say that at all. So in other words, the histogram just provides you protective bumpers to work within. It'll tell you whether you've over or underexposed areas, and you simply use the histogram as a guide that you can cross-reference your photo with as you're processing. And don't forget, you can download all the practice files that I use in this tutorial, as well as the video file for the histogram, by going to creativeraw.com/course and sign up for my free course here on Lightroom and Photoshop. All you need to do is put in your email address and you'll be sent a username and password for a free Creative Raw account, which will contain the download link to this video as well as all the practice files used. Now this account, you can think of like a vault, and this is where I store all of my free video tutorials and other resources specifically for creative processing in Lightroom and Photoshop, as well as landscape photography in general. I have full ebooks that you can download. I also have some PDF cheat sheets and field guides that you can print out, which are very helpful as quick reminders. And this account is also where you will find additional video tutorials that I will not be uploading to YouTube. This account here is the only place you'll be able to find those. So make sure to sign up for this free Creative Raw account in order to gain access to all of these resources. This is also where I'll be adding all of my future video tutorials as well. So this account here will be updated frequently with new content. So again, go to creativeraw.com/course and sign up for this free account if you are interested in learning more on how I process in Lightroom and Photoshop. Okay, let's go over a quick lesson recap here. The histogram is a visual representation of the tones in your image, both in the field and in processing. It's mainly used to monitor for clipped or damaged pixels, but it's also helpful for guiding your overall tonal distribution. For example, when you're dodging and burning. The horizontal axis of the graph represents the tonal range from black to white, and the vertical axis represents the frequency of that tone. The histogram panel in Lightroom has several unique features, such as showing you a highlight and shadow clipping warning, the color histograms as well as the RGB histogram, the EXIF and preview information, and also lab color values, specifically the lightness level, which is a more accurate way to evaluate how light or dark a pixel is. Now, there is a limitless number of tones, but Lightroom and Photoshop will group them into 256 tonal buckets, 0 representing pure black and 255 representing pure white. High or steep peaks on either end of the histogram represent clip detail, which should be watched for and evaluated. Colors have different lightness levels. For example, yellow is lighter than blue, even at the same saturation level. So you should always monitor your color channel histograms as well as your collective RGB histogram, just in case you're clipping pixels only in a specific color group. Your camera histogram is based off of the JPEG, not the RAW file, so pixels could be marked as being clipped in camera when they are actually not in the RAW file. So in other words, you have a little bit of leeway when using your in-camera histogram as a guide. And finally, the histogram is there to provide protective bumpers to work within, which help you make choices in the field and in the darkroom. However, a histogram is not a goal. In other words, there is no ideal histogram, and you shouldn't be processing your photo based on a specific histogram you're trying to achieve. It's simply a guide to help you work with the image you have. Alright, that's going to do it for this lesson. Thanks so much for joining me, and I will see you in the next one.